And we are recording this session, so everybody is aware. This is our first lecture in the current academic year. The committee has decided to have one seminar or one lecture on a relevant innovation topic every 2 months, and we'll have a series of 6 talks over the next 8 months. That'll take us to summer of 2025. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Keshen, who is a resident and had a great experience at Stanford BioDesign. So before I get to introducing Sam, if you have any questions during the talk that you'd like to asked, please put them in the chat. Joanna Giddens or I can relay those questions at the end of Sam's talk to Sam, or at the end if you want some live discussion, just put up your hand and we can go in that direction as well. So questions in the chat. And just really quickly about the IEC, the Innovation Entrepreneurship Committee. What do we do and what is it? It's essentially a committee that's designed to help, really push innovation in the Department of Surgery. I think everybody innovates in many ways day to day. So, continue pushing the boundaries, inventing new things and realizing value and bring it to light. So we really want to create a department with a vision is to become globally impactful for surgical innovation entrepreneurship. Our mandate is to have a platform to launch surgeon founders, to build a supportive and creative culture for innovations to take place, to have ideas and bring them to the market, to have ideas and have new technologies patented, and really develop a strategy focused on education, technical literacy, and financial resources for trainees and faculty. So education's huge. It's part of culture building. It's part of really disseminating the right information to people. So Sam's talk today is really one of the first steps in innovation. And, Sam is one of our superstar residents in orthopedics. He's currently in his 4th year, and, he does undergraduate studies in anatomy and cell biology at McGill prior to coming to the University of Toronto. He had a dual degree in both medicine and biomedical engineering at the undergraduate medical level. And, he has quite a bit of experience in surgical device development. One of the things that really stands about Sam is that, with his engineering background, his background in device development, he took those skills and went to Stanford and enrolled in the BioDesign program, where he really learned a certain methodology for coming up with ideas, validating ideas, and really kind of learning when do you take the leap and take an idea to the next level to build a company, build a product, and so forth. He's the current resident lead in the Innovation Entrepreneurship Committee in the Department of Surgery, and I think he'll deliver an excellent talk. So, Sam, why don't you come on and take it from here?
Great, thanks, Dr. Chahal. Appreciate it. Nice to see so many people on the talk to listen today. So, as Dr. Chahal mentioned, my name's Sam. I'm one of the residents in orthopedic surgery here at U of T. And I was also the 2022-2023 Surgery Innovation Fellow at Stanford BioDesign. So my talk today is going to be an introduction to needs finding in healthcare, but really it's needs finding, but also really most importantly needs assessment. So how do you take the idea that you have and sort of form it into a way that you can approach it systematically and assess whether the insight that you've had is something that's worth your time in order to pursue. And this is one step of many. So as Jazz mentioned, this is the first of many webinars in the Surgeon Entrepreneur series, and we hope it's going to be a good one. So just with that, the learning objectives for today are really to understand the first component of the BioDesign innovation process, learn how to identify problems that are likely to result in significant opportunities, both not necessarily only financial, but significant commercial successes, and learn how to translate observations that you see in your clinical practice or in other people's clinical practice into clinical need statements, how to evaluate ideas and these need statements based on the disease state of the problem, the solution landscape, and the involved stakeholders, and to learn how to scope and adjust the need statement based on all the information that you learn through some of your research. And some of this may not sound like it makes a lot of sense now, but we will hopefully get there by the end of the talk. So this is my only disclosure, not relevant to anything in the talk. So the disclaimer for this is just a single approach, and I am obviously biased from my perspectives, but I hope this is something that you all find useful or maybe can take to your approach or your endeavors. But everyone is going to approach this differently. This is just one way. Um, this part of innovation isn't necessarily the sexy part. It's not the prototyping or the VC raise or your approach to fundraising. But I think if you set yourself up well early on and you really take the time early, you can have much greater success with a lot less headache down the road. And that's what the goal of this talk is too. But I'd like to start this off. I'd also really like this to be interactive. So if you have questions that come up throughout the talk at any time, please raise your hand, let me know. And ideally, we'll have some time at the end of the talk for some discussion or questions. So I would just like to start this off with a little bit of a story, and this is sort of my first attempt at innovation. So pictured here is myself as a third-year medical student with a mentor of mine, the great Dr. Stephen Lewis, here at the University of Toronto. And at the time, I was just a med student who was interested in orthopedic surgery, and I'd spent a lot of time with Dr. Lewis, both doing research and getting involved in sort of the clinical settings when I was able to, and joining him in his OR. And that was a really great first sort of immersive, insight into medicine for me. And so for those of you who are orthopedic surgeons on the call, I'm sorry for how simple this is, but for anyone who's not aware, in spine surgery and specifically in spine deformity surgery, we place rods and screws into the bone in an attempt to make them straight. And during an operation like this, many screws will be placed. And this is using special taps and special screwdrivers that allow us to, ideally put those screws into the bone. And so this is sort of what it looks like when you put a pedicle screw or one of these screws into the vertebrae in order to make them straight. And you can see that, on the right side here, we have a screw that's going nicely into the bone, but on the left side, there are times when the screw can go not exactly where we'd like it to, and it can either go medially into the canal or it can go laterally. And I observed that, from spending time in the operating room, that sometimes the screws didn't go exactly where we intended, and that can have consequences. So it could mean that the construct wasn't as strong, or depending where the screw was going, it could mean that patient would have symptoms. So, this was just an observation. It was difficult to know what the trajectory was of the screw, and sometimes that screw, could be misplaced, and that was suboptimal and created a lot of headache for a lot of different people. So, at this time, knowing, not all that much, the question was really, well, how could this instrument be prevented from taking the wrong trajectory? Was there something that we could do to make this better? And I got together with some people, some friends of mine, mechanical engineers, other people who are interested in medicine, and we started conceptualizing, how could we find a way to make these tools better and not have them go where we don't want them to. So we came up with this concept, which was a device that had all the workings of the trocar that they already used in order to create the pilot holes for the vertebrae. And this one was special in that it had a mechanism on the end of it that would ideally determine when that screw or that tip was in the wrong position. And that was all through this relatively sophisticated spring mechanism that would cause an alert in the handle and would feed back to the person using the tool to know that they had maybe gone to the wrong place. So, this seemed like it was pretty reasonable. It sounded like a kind of interesting idea. So, I further collaborated with a colleague of mine and close friend who's a mechanical engineer, and we talked about it further. And this, back of the napkin sort of drawing became a rendering, and we made the images and the pieces more refined, and we talked about, how these would interact with each other and actually function. So, that drawing became a rendering, and then that rendering became a prototype. And so we 3D printed out of plastics and using scrap pieces of metal, this tool that looked somewhat like what people were using in spine surgery, and had this little update in terms of being able to tell you ideally where you were putting the screw. And we prototyped and prototyped and prototyped, and it started looking a little bit more like something that was real. We tried this on chicken bones and on saw bones and on just rudimentary objects, and we felt like we were making progress. And so, this is really just more of the refined versions of the type of mechanism that we had designed. And we said, hey, this is seeming kind of cool. Maybe we should file a patent for this. So we got together and we wrote our first patent, and we came and created the design drawings, and we filed a patent on this device. And it was exciting because we were finally able to show it to people and talk about it in public and get people's impressions. And we showed it to some people from surgery, some people from industry, and even had some brief discussions with one of the larger med tech companies. to discuss our idea. And so this was, as a young person interested in innovation, interested in medicine, this was quite exciting. But ultimately, we had a bit of a reality check. A product does not equal a business, and we sort of learned this the hard way through the feedback that we got. And the reality check and the learning was really multifaceted. First of all, when we looked into it, the orthopedics and the spine market penetration is challenging. When you look at how the economics of these industries work, they're really predominantly dominated by major med tech companies, the Strykers, the Zimmer Biomets, the Medtronics, and breaking into that industry as an independent anything is very challenging, and you're somewhat at the mercy of those companies. So that was one part of it. The other thing was the landscape of the field was changing somewhat. So this was an observation that we had made based on a pretty singular experience at a singular place. But that wasn't the case everywhere. And at some places people use navigation and they use robotics, and this was different than people that were placing their screws freehand. And so while this certainly may have had a bit of utility for a certain subset of this market, it wasn't necessarily as widely distributed. Additionally, and I think arguably more importantly, it's challenging. We had a suboptimal reimbursement or payment plan for how the economics of our instrument would work. It turns out that these companies don't make a whole lot of money on their devices, but they make money on their implants, and they are willing to give trays and trays and trays of instruments to surgeons just so that they use their implants. So having any unique innovation in just one specific device that's going to be part of a greater set or greater tray of tools isn't something that gets these companies so excited, because that's not really where they make their money. So ultimately, this ended up being an excellent learning example and opportunity for me, but really nothing that would be considered a commercial success. So, I mean, in my opinion, the mistake here is that we focused on the solution and rather than focusing on what the problem was. And so that is really the focus of this talk, and where we can hopefully, and now where I can hopefully share with you how I think you can hopefully go and avoid that in the future from making the same mistake that I did. So I talked a little bit about the Stanford Fellowship. And so just to give you a bit of a background, so between my second and third year of residency, I took time off to go to Silicon Valley and spend some time on the Stanford campus as part of their BioDesign Fellowship. Effectively, it's a fellowship where they take 12 fellows across diverse backgrounds from medicine, engineering, consulting, business, and pharma. And the goal is to teach a structured and repeatable innovation process that allows for the highest chance of developing a successful product repeatedly. So if you follow this process over and over again, hopefully you're going to give yourself a better chance of success. And we had really fantastic experiences working on real world projects within an area of predefined need. Ours was emergency medicine, but really the goal was to learn this BioDesign framework. And through that, I had tons of amazing opportunities and experiences to sort of put this to the test. So what is that? So the BioDesign process really is not rocket science, but it is three stages of design and innovation. So the first stage is the identify phase. It's followed by the invent phase, and it's followed by the implement phase. So the identify phase is this needs finding and needs screening. So when you're looking in your career, or your place of work, when you come up with an idea, how do you find something that's worth pursuing, and how do you evaluate whether that thing is worth pursuing? The next stage is concept generation, concept screening. So really creating the actual innovation that you're hoping to solve the problem for. And the third stage is the implementation phase. So how do you actually take that idea that you created and then turn it into a real business and get it funded and get it into the workplace? Now, you can see here that these are iterative processes. So these all cycle back on each other. And it's not just a linear process, but the part that is linear is that the identify phase comes before the invent phase, and the invent phase comes before the implement phase. And so really the focus here is that this is a needs-based process at its core. And I think it's important to highlight that. So really, one of my mentors is a revered cardiologist and medical innovator, a guy named Paul Yock, says a well-characterized need is the DNA of a great invention. And so this whole process is focused on spending a lot of time up front, making sure you're going after the right thing. And it is a solution agnostic phase. So that is where we're going to focus on for the talk of today. And so, why? So why is this important? So, I mean, medical innovation is incredible. I think most people on this call are probably physicians, or we work in healthcare or healthcare adjacent fields. And we go into it because we have a fascination with human health and we feel good about having the chance to help people and make significant differences in their lives. But, as clinicians and physicians, we have a somewhat limited ability in how many people we can reach with our skills and our abilities. But in innovation, if you create something, you can have an incredible reach and serve a whole great number of people. And this chart here is just a log of the companies that have been spun out purely from the biodesign process. In over 20 years, they've reached more than 13 million patients. So, I mean, there really is an opportunity to do great stuff in innovation, but it's really expensive. So the average class 2 medical device, for those of you who aren't familiar, there are three classes of medical devices. Class 1 being, something like a Band-Aid, really low risk. Class 3 being an implantable cardio defibrillator, and class 2 being something somewhere in between. So even just the average class 2 device requires on average 6 years of time and roughly 30 million US dollars before it gets to market. So, I mean, this shows you all the different phases. There's the proof of concept, the clinical development, obtaining sort of your ability to test this, then doing your studies, eventually obtaining FDA approval. All of these are extremely lengthy and extremely costly processes. And, you want to make sure you're going after the right thing. Additionally, this is a regulated industry, so you can't just change things up on the fly once you've committed to it. And because of that, like I said, you really want to make sure that when you're going after something, that you're going after something that's worth it, that you're going to get right, and that you're going to have some opportunity. And so that's where this comes into play. So go through this again. But really, all of this starts with just an observation. And partly that's the courage just to challenge dogma. So I think this is an awesome slide. So multiple unsolved needs this way in OR 12, but this person here is saying, nope, it says right here in the surgery text that all of those problems have been completely solved. So I think many of the people on this chat now or on this call now are surgeons. And I think when you spend a lot of time with surgeons, they like to do things a certain way. And that makes a lot of sense because it's safe and it's repeatable, and that's great. But often we can be stuck in our ways and we can just continue with the status quo because it's just the way that it is, or it's just the way that it's always been done. But really there's numerous and like uncountable numbers of needs that are still unsolved in all of our ORs across all of our subspecialties, and even outside the OR that we just, if you open your eyes to them, they're there to be found. So I think that's just the first part, is you have to be willing to ask, why do we do this, and how and why can we do things better. But so in terms of observations, this we won't spend too much time on. This is, but be truly curious. So pay attention to the steps that you're taking, pay attention to the steps that other people are doing, and take notes of moments that are friction or challenge. Why did something bother you? Why did something bother your colleague or the anesthesiologist or the radiologist? Where was it? Where was that a challenge? Question everything. Keep a running list of the inquiries that you get stimulated by from your different observations, and find patterns. So between your colleagues or between your own ORs, are these things that you keep seeing over and over again, or was this a one-off that you really didn't you don't experience all that often. And I think most importantly, listen. So you want to talk to all the different players that are involved. We'll get more to this later in the talk, but you want to absorb what different stakeholders do and what they're saying, and also how they're saying it in terms of your observations. Most importantly, keep a log of everything. So, when you have something that you think is an observation that you think is worthy for innovation, describe the setting, who is involved, the time and effort required. And really, there's nothing that's too large or too small. Like, these observations can turn into unbelievable innovations, even by the smallest thing. It's not necessarily a eureka moment, but often just a very subtle understanding of, hey, that interesting. Like, this often causes us a lot of grief, and it can be a small thing that turns into something great. And so, again, who's in the room and what are their behaviors? What are people doing? And what are the steps that they're going through? What does the environment look like? What are the interactions in that environment look like? And what are the objects that you're using? And these observations can be around things that cause pain for patients. It can be around instrument malfunctions, complications that are caused, just general stress or uncertainty of a part of your procedure. Inconvenience is one. It's usually a little more challenging to get people on board with things that just inconvenience surgeons, but there certainly needs to be solved, or inefficiencies in dogma. So these are all things that you can keep your eyes open to and consider for innovation. So this is from our BioDesign textbook, and it's just an example of an observation. This was from someone who wasn't working in surgery, observing a surgery, saying, the resident was allowed to close the incision. The suture was dropped and had to be recovered multiple times. The closing the incision took approximately 50 minutes, and the doctor at the time said this is a balance between closing quickly and closing right. And then the questions say, is this because this is a non-critical step? Why did this take longer than expected? And it's perceived that speed and quality are in opposition, but maybe that's not the case. And so I think many of us might look at this and say, well, that's silly. Like, we suture a million times. Who cares about this observation? But this was actually one of the observations that led on to a company that designed like a zip closure device for incisions, where they put sticky adhesives and use zip ties to close the wounds. And it's just based on just a simple observation that it took a long time to close sutures or to close the incision. So just to highlight that point. So the next part, this is slightly more technical somewhat, but I think the next part I'd like to focus on is how you turn one of these observations into what we call in BioDesign a need statement. And so after the observations, the next step is to effectively make a hypothesis on what you're hoping to achieve by solving the problem that you've observed. And a structured way of doing this is by forming what's called a need statement. And it may feel like an academic exercise, but it's actually really useful in terms of pushing the next steps forward. So the need statement, it's iterative. So you may go back to your need statement and refine it multiple times based on what you find next, but effectively it will shape how you later approach your solutions and how you approach solving your problem. And it has three components: the core health problem that you're trying to solve, the group of people or patients that you're targeting for your solution, and finally, the outcome that you hope to achieve by solving your problem. And so some people who have done quality improvement work will notice a similar framework when you ask questions in that domain. And it's actually, there's a lot of crossover. So on the next slide, so the need statement ends up being a way to address your problem in a certain population that leads to a certain outcome. And your outcomes that you can go after are numerous. You can look for improved clinical outcome. You can look for safety, reduced costs, productivity, ease of use. These are just examples of what different types of outcomes are. And I'll show you a couple examples. So my group at Stanford were observing in the emergency department, and that was our goal. And then from our observations, we developed a whole host of need statements from things that we had seen as problems. So for example, a way to increase pelvic floor elasticity in nulliparous patients giving vaginal delivery to prevent third and fourth degree tears. A way to prevent cardiac allograft vasculopathy in patients with heart transplant in order to reduce the 5-year mortality rate. A way to improve wound healing in patients with neuropathic plantar diabetic foot ulcers in order to reduce the 1-year ulcer recurrence rate. Or a way to preserve renal function in patients following uncontrolled cardiac death in the emergency department in order to increase the availability of viable donor kidneys. And, I think an important part here is it depends on who you are and what you're trying to do with your innovation. If you're a student or if you're a serial innovator, you might be working with multiple needs at a given time. And having these statements this way are a really useful way to compare things between one another to decide on the thing that you want to actually pursue. But often in the case of clinicians or surgeons, you're only going to be working on a single need or a single observation at a given time. But it's still very useful to have it written out in this way because it really does guide the next phase of the process and even guides way down the line in terms of how you can even set up your trials to prove the thing you're doing is actually having the effect that it does. So it really is a purposeful approach for the next phases of research and development. So now once you have your need statements settled, the next part of this is to do a research and deep dive into the problem. And again, I can't highlight this enough. The goal of this phase is to just completely understand the problem and not create any solutions. So I think it's very difficult for surgeons and clinicians to want to say, I have a problem, here's my solution to it right away. But I think if I can share any piece of insight, it's to try your best not to do that and just 100% understand the problem before you try to create any solutions. And so with our need statement written, it's now time to truly understand that problem. And this involves internet research. It involves interviews with domain experts for our the case of clinicians and surgeons, that might be with your colleagues or with senior colleagues, as well as with patients and allied health workers. And this research is really based on 4 main pillars. It's based on the disease state fundamentals, the stakeholders that are involved in the problem that you're trying to solve, the existing solutions that exist, and the market analysis of that. And so we'll go a little bit into each one of these. So starting with the disease state fundamentals, This seems very obvious for people in medicine, but honestly, there's so much value to going back and just understanding this problem, the anatomy and physiology, and even the pathophysiology on a deeper level that you may have previously. So, the epidemiology, understanding the prevalence and incidence, this will help you later for your market analysis. The anatomy and physiology, like even though many of you on the call are experts in your domain, you may not really consider the detailed anatomy of everything that you work on. And maybe it's that one receptor is part of a pathway, or that one ligament that you don't ever really think about that can actually be a good target for an innovation. And going back and knowing it is really going to help you in the later phases. And same thing with the pathophysiology. So what causes the disease? Is there a mechanism of action from a biological perspective, from a chemical perspective, mechanical or electrophysiologic abnormalities? Are those all targets of things that are part of your problem that you don't really think about on a day-to-day basis? And it's much more difficult to find solutions for conditions in which that pathophysiology is poorly understood. So when you know this up front, or when you know the pathophysiology down cold, it's going to really help your next phase. And this next slide is extremely busy, but I wanted to give an example. So this was the need that I'd showed you before about cardiac allograft vasculopathy, which is effectively a condition that happens to patients who have heart transplants where they get concentric narrowing of their heart vessels, and it leads to graft failure. And so one of our needs here, we were looking to see if there was a biochemical target that we could find that was novel, to innovate in this field. And what we did was we went through all of the research that had been done on this topic, and we made a map of all the interactions between all the different receptors for this condition. And this had actually never been done before, but this was just an amalgamation of other people's research, and each one of these different receptors became a target for a way to do a solution. And again, this is a solution agnostic phase, but here we understood the physiology, and here we could, guide the next steps in terms of our development for a solution. So the next step is stakeholder analysis, and this is really, really important. So it's critical to understand which groups, in terms of the healthcare system, are actually involved or affect the care choices in your area of need. So there's no one that's like too important or too unimportant regarding your problem. So when you make your observation, really write down everybody that's there and know everybody that might be involved. So whether that's patients and their families, physicians and nurses, physician assistants, technicians, and everyone in between. And a really useful thing here is to think beyond just the direct care in hospitals, but also how the admin of the hospital are going to react to this problem, how insurance companies or Medicare or the FDA think about these things, because again, those are all stakeholders that you're going to have to convince at some point that your solution, whatever it may be, is useful. So knowing who those people are up front is very, very helpful. And one of the ways to do that is with a cycle of care analysis. So you basically track an episode of healthcare from the patient presenting or the patient recognizing their symptoms, and to all the way that they pass through different stages of healthcare or different providers, ultimately ending up to where you are, or where you've noticed your observation. So I'll show some observations there too. And here it's really a good opportunity to think, what's the scope of the problem? Is this an issue across all practice settings or just yours? Why is that the case? Are there critical aspects of delivery that must be respected with your solution? And this is really based on interviews and surveys with different stakeholders, and in many cases that may be colleagues. And again, the nice part about this is there's no IP risk here, because you're not presenting anybody a solution. You're just trying to ask those people whether they recognize the same problem that you do. So this is an example which I think highlights that a little bit. So this was from some work that I was working on for a group that was working on autonomous ultrasound. So the ability to have ultrasound without needing an X-ray or an ultrasound tech. And so effectively, a patient comes with an MSK complaint. They maybe see their primary care physician, or they maybe see go to the emergency department. And then from there, one of a few things might be happen. They might have ultrasound performed by that provider. They might be referred to get an ultrasound outside of that, which would be performed by a technician. Then they might get back to the specialist, and they might get an MRI. That MRI will be interpreted by the radiologist, or the ultrasound will be interpreted by the radiologist. And then they'll end up either back at their primary care physician or the emergency department. And then ultimately, they'll end up getting their treatment plan. So it seems very simple. You may all know this intuitively based on how your patients end up in your office. But really sometimes it's these things where you can really find an insight in terms of, oh, like, that can be cut out or this can be cut out, or maybe there's a pain point or a friction point in this interaction or a delay in care between this point and that point. And it can actually be, very useful. This is another example. We don't have to go through this in its entirety, but this was looking at end-stage renal disease and dialysis. And here you can see, from a patient developing symptoms all the way to receiving a transplant, there's all these different steps that come in. And if you're, depending on what your need is or what you're trying to innovate in, all of these individual visits might be points of intervention for you to actually have an improvement on that condition. And maybe that's where you innovate. And so again, because this is solution agnostic, you're just understanding the pipeline so that you have all the opportunities to innovate at any one of the steps. So once you have all your stakeholders identified, you also really want to know what each one of their perspectives is, because all the stakeholders involved in your story or in your observation or problem will all have different interests in maintaining that problem, or they'll just care about that problem differently. Some of them will be interested in solving it. Some of them may actually have active disinterest in solving that problem. And knowing who has the power or who cares and who doesn't care is actually very useful in terms of who you target with your solutions and who you seek to gain information from. So for instance, going back to that MSK ultrasound example, so these are all the different stakeholders surrounding ultrasound. So you have the first responders, you have the ultrasound technicians, primary care providers, MRI technicians, surgeons, sports medicine physicians, and the ones in green are people that would probably really have some interest and care to promote an autonomous ultrasound, versus the ones in red may actually not want that because that might compromise sort of their income. So lots of different ways. They have different levels of interest and different levels of influence, and some of them are positive and some of them are negative. And again, just having this known at this phase can be really useful. The next stage in evaluating your need is just trying to find what are the existing solutions. So you want to know everything there is to know about the solution landscape. So you've had this realization, okay, this is a problem that I've seen. Well, how is it currently being addressed today? And what are the reasons that these are addressed? Are there a range of solution types? Are there drugs? Are there devices, biologics? Are there upstream things like lifestyle interventions or behavioral modifications that are useful? And what are the things that actually have the most efficacy? Because you may be surprised to think that the first thought of yours as to how you'd intervene here, it might actually not be one that has the biggest gap or the biggest opportunity. So you want to know with everything that's considered the standard of care, because you're going to benchmark against that. And you want to also know things that are also in the pipeline. So what are the new technologies or drugs that are sort of in trials that could be the next wave of solution for this issue. So I think we can skip through this. It's just a bit of an example there. The last bit here is on market analysis. And so I don't think we're going to get overly technical into a market analysis here, but I think it's a very, very important thing to do, even just when you understand the epidemiology of a problem and a rough overview of how much money that problem costs the healthcare system or costs a patient, because some problems just don't have the market in order to sustain a viable solution, or that market is what it is, and maybe it does, but you just have to know that you're going to be working within those limitations, and you may not have the luxury of having a very complex, expensive solution to a problem that just doesn't have the market to sustain that. So that's really where this comes from. But so you want to understand your total market potential and benchmark the opportunity that you've identified. At this phase, because you're not actually looking at any specific solution, it can be challenging to know exactly what that market is, but you can make an estimate, and I'll show you with an example here. One of the best ways to do that is with a top-down estimate of the market. And effectively, you determine the size of the population that you've specified in your need statement, and then you multiply that by the average cost to treat that patient. And from that, you get a general market size, and you know how much money you're working with in terms of the total pie that you can take with your solution, no matter what that solution may be. So for instance, this is an example of someone who did this analysis working with preventing COPD readmission or preventing preventable COPD readmissions to hospitals. So here you can see that there's about 12 million COPD patients per year. Some of them will go to the ED. About 900,000 of those people will be hospitalized. And of those, some of them are readmissions over a longer period, and some of them are admissions within 30 days. And within the 30-day admissions, a certain proportion of those, roughly 80%, are preventable. And so if you know that you have 144,000 preventable readmissions at roughly $14,000 per readmission, you know that that problem of COPD readmissions that are preventable cost the healthcare system roughly $2.1 billion per year. And if you have $2.1 billion to work with, there's a lot of creative solutions that you can come up with that sort of fit within that market. And you have a lot of room. But on the other hand, if you find out that that actually only costs the healthcare system $50 million per year, you have far less scope in terms of the solutions that you can create. And again, you're not thinking of the solutions yet, but you will eventually. So that's why this is just helping you identify which of these problems are, have a lot of worth to them. Okay, so the next phase is after you've done all this research. So you've had your observation, you've turned this into a needs statement. You've done all the research for these 4 pillars to understand what needs are good or not good, or you've learned a whole bunch about the disease state or in the solution landscape and the market. And the next step is to scope the need based on those findings from your research. And what this does is it shifts your problem or your population or your outcome up or down based on the findings that you found. So for instance, this is just an example. So observation, some of the orthopedic surgeons will appreciate this example. An elderly patient is admitted to hospital with sepsis secondary to a periprosthetic joint infection. So someone come up with a need statement, a way to decrease the incidence of infections associated with hip implants in the elderly in order to reduce hospital stays. So that's a reasonable need statement. It has a problem, it has a population that's very specific, and it has an outcome that is also very specific and addressable. But at this point, after you've done your research and you know the pathophysiology and you know the incidences of these events, now it's time to say, well, okay, am I focusing too narrow or am I focusing too broad, or is there a better outcome that I can choose from this? So, for instance, can this be applied to a wider age range? So, does it matter that the infections are specifically in the elderly? And it might be the case that you've learned that infections in the elderly present differently, or they have significantly greater mortality than infections in younger people, and that might be a reason to keep the elderly. Alternatively, you might find that it really isn't all that different, and a solution that addresses one will likely address the other, and maybe it's worth being a little broader. Is there a difference between patients with joint arthroplasty versus other hardware? So again, why focusing on one versus both? Maybe there's a reason to, maybe there's not. Can this be applied to the knee or other joints, or is it really important that it's just focused on hip implants? Do infections present differently in the hip? Is it harder to eradicate infections in the hip compared to the knee or the shoulder? Maybe, maybe not. And that's all based on sort of the research that you do and again, narrowing or broadening this need statement. And then finally, is reducing hospital stay the best outcome? So sure, that's pretty measurable, but does it matter? If you reduce the hospital stay, but people die, are you happy with that outcome? So maybe, maybe not. And again, this is based on your talking to other people, talking to experts, and reading the literature, and that's how you scope this up or down. So again, just not to beat a dead horse here, but you further explore the problem, the population, and the desired outcome, and the interactions between those components, and you systematically try out differing levels of focus or specificity for each of them, while remaining overall centered in the general area and in the observation that you've made. Can it be broadened? Can it be narrowed? And what's the best reason to do that? And lastly, most importantly, sort of, is the outcome that you've described the most relevant one, or is there a better one to pick that is more relevant to your population? Okay, so the next stage, after this is done and you've scoped your need and you finally landed and said, okay, this is the specific need statement for my observation that I think is as focused and as reasonable as I think it should be. The next stage is formation of needs criteria. And the needs criteria are going to be things that you've observed or you've learned from your research that are absolutely critical in terms of solving your need. Now, again, this has nothing to do with your solution, but the solutions that you eventually create must follow these criteria in order to actually solve your problem. And so I'll give you some examples. So this is a bullet point set of requirements that captures really the most important elements that any new solution to your need will address. So again, completely solution agnostic. And if you are able to devise a solution that delivers against these criteria, you should be pretty confident that it will be well received and hopefully adopted, because that's what you've learned from your market research and your talking to experts or your colleagues. And there's two real main types of criteria. There's the must-have criteria, which are just absolute, non-starters, and then the nice-to-have criteria, which are elements that you think would be really great features to have as part of your solution, but may not be absolutely critical. The key here is that both of these criteria should be extremely specific and they should be extremely measurable. So there are four real main categories of these, mostly safety, efficacy, usability, and cost, and we'll go over some examples. So this is an example of a needs statement from a company called Lully, and they were looking to solve the issue of night terrors in young children. So the needs statement that they were working with was a way to prevent night terrors in children under 5 years old in order to increase nights without sleep disturbance. So when you looked through their needs criteria, so in terms of their efficacy, they set their efficacy as reduces nights with episodes by at least 50%. And the reason they did that was because they found that based on surveys and talking to parents, that if parents could get uninterrupted sleep at least every other night, that's something that they would find meaningful. So 50% was their benchmark. Again, effective within 1 month of nightly use. So when they did that survey, they found that if the solution took longer than that, as many of them did, then the parents and the kids lost interest and it just became not very useful for them. So that was a critical thing to have. Cost less than $250. So again, based on their reports and talking to the people that were actually using these different types of solutions, that was an average spend that parents were trying, and that was something that if they saw that price point would be a reasonable thing to pursue, and they think nothing of it. But more than that, they may not want to uptake it. And then lastly, safety does not cause an increase in the sleepiness scale, which is sort of a risk of daytime sleepiness. And from their studies and conversations, they found that they were not willing to have any solution that would compromise the safety of their child, obviously. And so that was a criteria for them. Looking over at the nice to haves, I mean, obviously, if you can reduce the episodes by 80%, then that's great, but it's really an aspirational improvement and it's not absolutely necessary. If it's able to treat other arousal disorders, that's also fantastic. But I mean, it's not the critical aspect here. If you can make it even cheaper, that's fantastic. But they found that the price point that they had set was acceptable. And we don't have to go through every single one of these because I have some more examples coming up. But you can see how these criteria can be very useful based on the research that you do in order to guide how you create your solutions or what the parameters of your solutions should be. And so going back to the example that I gave before, so this was our need that we worked on, a way to prevent cardiac allograft vasculopathy in patients following heart transplant in order to reduce 5-year mortality. So we spoke to, dozens of cardiologists around the United States, and, they found that if it wasn't worth it for them if they didn't increase the 5-year mortality by at least 20%. Like nothing to them would be acceptable if it was anything less than that. Even that was somewhat low, but that was the absolute floor. In terms of safety, these are patients that are obviously at risk for sudden cardiac death or myocardial infarction. So whatever solution that we were designing couldn't increase that risk. And additionally, these patients are often re-imaged or have other percutaneous interventions. And so whatever we designed couldn't interfere with that. From a usability perspective, as these are all transplant patients, they're all on immunosuppression. So whatever we designed had to be compatible with the current standards for immunosuppression. And these are absolute must-have criteria. So if our solution that we designed failed any of these, really it wasn't worth doing because it was just overwhelming from the evidence and the conversations that we had that would not be well received in that community. Looking at the nice to have, so maybe it would be great if it could reduce the frequency of invasive imaging. It would be great if it could be effective for other types of transplants that weren't cardiac, but those are all just nice things to have. It would be great if it would reduce the daily medication requirements for these patients in terms of their immunosuppression, but I mean, again, that's not the core aspect of the need. So those fall in the nice to haves. And then again, this is another need that we looked at. So this was a need in terms of trying to increase the number of viable donor kidneys based on a pretty radical approach used, by actually getting them from patients that die in the emergency department. And in terms of the efficacy, we found that it wasn't really worth it in terms of providers if it didn't increase the conversion rate of transplant by at least 25%. It can't increase the risk of graft failure in these patients because just because you're getting a kidney, if it's not one that's going to last a long time or have good uptake, then that's not worth it for transplant surgeons. It can't interfere with the resuscitation measures prior to the determination of death because that opens up a whole set of issues. So, I mean, we don't have to go through all of these individually, but you can see how in having conversations with your stakeholders and doing the research, talking to patients and all the people involved in your problem, you can understand what they are going to want to see in order to try a new solution. And it can really help you not because if you don't and you just make something and it turns out that if you just ask people, they would have told you that that would never be taken up for this or that reasons. It saves yourself a whole lot of time, a whole lot of money if you're doing it in a professional way, and a whole lot of headache. So with the need and the criteria well defined, now is when you can start developing solutions. And so I know I preface this by saying this isn't the sexy part of the innovation process because it's the part that just requires a lot of research and a lot of self-reflection and a lot of just diving into your problem so that you are an expert on your problem. But if you start from this and you have a really strong foundation of the problem that you're trying to solve, then the next phase, which is where you start coming up with your solutions, becomes a whole lot easier. And hopefully, it's just a lot more efficient and it gives you the best chance of having a result that's successful. So, with that, that's the end of my actual talk. So I'd love to take any questions or hear from have a discussion.
Thanks a lot, Sam. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks for sharing your experience through your innovation journey. There is one question. I believe the last name is Chata. What areas of orthopedic surgery do you think are most in need of innovation? How do you envision new technology impacting patient care in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I just had the answer to be able to say what that is. I mean, nothing about me makes me to be able to say I know what the next area of innovation is in orthopedic surgery. I think we are a specialty that works all over the body using a whole host of different tools with a whole range of patients. Um, from children to the elderly to patients who are injured to very sick and cancer and arthritis. And so we have so many different types of patients. And I think rather than say like this is one area that I think is ripe for innovation, I think going back to it, all of those patients and all their journeys will have very different stakeholder involvements. They'll have different pathophysiologies to all those things. They'll have different requirements or different scopes of areas to innovate. And so I think really it's a good example of being able to understand the differences and just saying, I'm going to innovate or make a great tool that's going to work across all of orthopedic surgery by saying, maybe if I scope that down and say, well, actually, this is designed for patients that have a sarcoma or elderly patients with a sarcoma, that innovation is very different than elderly patients with arthritis, right? And it's just about thinking through it. And so I don't know that I have a good answer to that, but I hope that this process can be useful in terms of you answering that question for yourself.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Carrie.
Sure. Thanks so much. That was a great presentation to hear your journey through all of these different pieces. I'm just wondering, so what do you think about our Canadian healthcare system? Where do we have advantages in this area of entrepreneurship, and where do we have disadvantages?
Yeah, well, I think two things. One, I think from what I've heard, comparatively to the FDA, Health Canada is very, very interactive and very receptive. So I think Health Canada does a very good job in terms of meeting with them when you have an idea. This might be further down the line in terms of what they need to see data from. They're very user-friendly per se in terms of that for innovators, which I think is great. I think we have a more straightforward healthcare system in the sense that being a single payer, we don't necessarily have to focus on the certain types of things that innovators in the States have to think about, such as where they're going to get their payments from. It's part of a larger talk that I think comes later, but when it comes to reimbursement in the United States, they have to get coverage and coding decisions done by these major payers, and it's often very challenging to do that across the different people who provide reimbursement. So often innovators will start with the public payers like Medicare and Medicaid, and after that commercial insurance will follow with that. in order to finally get reimbursed for one of their new innovations. I think in our case with a single payer, you don't have to go to as many different people in order to get reimbursement in that way. But at the same time, there's not as much competition, and if that payer is not willing to reimburse your product, then you're kind of out of luck. So that's, I think, the pros and cons. Unfortunately, I think it's very, very challenging for Canadian innovators to innovate purely for a Canadian market. And I think it just comes back down to simply our population. And simply just the number of people that have access to any in specific technology. Like, it just costs so much money to do this that you need enough people to be wanting to use your innovation, or enough uses of that on a yearly basis to be able to make it worth it. And with just such a small population, it's hard if you're just focusing on Canada. But with that said, I think we have tremendous ability to run trials here and innovate for North America. And we have a very similar patient population in terms of culture and demographics to a lot of places in the United States that make Canada like an attractive place to study and do some of these trials.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Carrie. I'll open up the floor to other questions. In the meantime, Sam, how many, like, if you identify a problem or like a clinical area you want to observe and identify like friction points, like typically, like how many need statements does somebody go through with this methodology before they commit to an idea? You know, like it's like, how do you know you're focusing on the right problem or the right need?
Yeah,
And like how much divergence do you need before you say, you know what, this is where I want to commit my time, my money, and my energy?
it's a good question. Well, first of all, I think it also depends on who is listening to this talk and who in the current stage of their practice or um, is trying to do this. Because some people will be sort of innovative, serial innovators, and they just want to look for the next opportunity across anything. And in that case, the world is your oyster. You observe wherever you do, you write as many statements as you want across different domains, different specialties. And any of those could turn into great innovations. I think probably for clinicians and surgeons, and it's harder to come up and be an innovator or start a company for something that's out of your domain, because you're so exposed and you're such an expert in your thing that it's hard to just go observe other people's rooms or other people's practice settings. So I think that depends, but I don't know that it's necessarily so much about having so many different need statements, because I think if you're just someone that has an idea, it's okay to just have one or two, or just compete your own internal ideas against one another based on things that you've noticed over the course of your career or your practice. But I think no matter what your observation is, they can all be evaluated through this framework. And if you have one or two things that you're thinking of, the sad reality is that you can't do both. And if you commit to one of these real things that you'd like to turn into a real commercial innovation, like I said at the beginning, it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time and it's a big, big commitment. So I think you want to just make sure that you know everything that you can about all those problems. And you might come to realize that observation that you made with that first assumption actually doesn't bear out in terms of the epidemiology, or it doesn't bear out in terms of the market size. And while it seemed like a great idea, it actually maybe is one that's going to have a lower chance of success. So when you compare it to something else that maybe has a bigger market opportunity, a more well-defined pathophysiology, maybe more gaps in the current existing solution space, those are all green check marks, and say, well, that opportunity may not be better than the other one, but it just has a higher chance of success. And then you can make that determination yourself. Oh, I think you're muted there.
Sorry, one follow-up. When you initially identify a need statement and you come up with some solutions, obviously with experience, the life cycle of the idea probably decreases, or the time from idea to market decreases. But what do you find? How much time is required from ideation to prototyping to the final prototype that you wanna build?
Yeah, I think once you get through this part and you've committed on your need, then the prototyping can happen pretty quickly. And so I mean, this is a point for another talk, but the next part of the phase is really also very iterative, and it's also the goal is to brainstorm as many different ways to solve your problem as you can, and then to look into each one of your individual solutions to compare them back against some of these criteria that you've set in this phase and say, okay, which one of the solutions that I've come up with here actually solves that the best based on all those things that we've identified early on from just our research. And then those ideas you then compete against one another. So, maybe you had a certain implant and maybe you had a sensor or some diagnostic device, and maybe one of them was implantable and one of them was something that sat on the skin. And they're both great ideas, but you compare them against your criteria and you find that one actually has a better chance than the other. That one moves forward, and you can rapidly prototype that until you get something that's sort of like more minimally viable. But I think that part really goes quickly. So once you at least are locked in on your problem and you feel like you've understood it quickly, then your ability to create solutions and prototype is only limited by your resources and who you have working with you or what you have the ability to do. So that can happen fast.
Okay, fantastic. We are nearly out of time. We have a minute left till 6 o'clock. To wrap up, if you had one final message for the viewers, if you're going to wrap up the main theme of your talk today, if they could take away one point, what would it be?
Focus on the problem and not on the solution.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks to everybody for
Thank you.
attending and for sticking around the entire hour. Our next webinar will be in approximately 2 months. We look forward to having you there, and have a great evening.
Thanks so much.